Luminol does not tell stories. It does not speculate. It does not care who you are or what you claim happened. It reacts only to what remains. Inside a quiet home on Waterview Drive in Wetumpka, Alabama, investigators sprayed luminol across floors, walls, and corners that looked perfectly clean. To the naked eye, there was nothing unusual. Fresh paint. New flooring. No visible signs of a struggle. A house that appeared ready for a new beginning. Then the lights went out. Under forensic light, the truth surfaced. More than 20 separate stains and smears appeared. Not random. Not accidental. Patterns consistent with biological material that had been aggressively cleaned but never fully erased. The DNA would later confirm what luminol had already suggested. The biological traces belonged to Susan Lynn Osborne and her 14-year-old son, Evan. By the time that evidence was found, Susan and Evan had already been gone for weeks. They vanished at the end of May 2017. No goodbye. No note. No financial activity. No phone usage. No travel records. Their home was locked. Their belongings were missing. Their lives appeared to have been wiped clean, both digitally and physically. At first, the case was treated as a disappearance. A mother leaving town. A son going with her. That explanation would not survive scrutiny. Susan was not someone who disappeared without warning. She was a devoted mother, deeply involved in her children's lives, especially Evan's medical care. Evan had appointments that required planning, preparation, and medication. He did not simply miss them. Susan never missed them. Yet Evan did not show up. As the days passed, silence replaced routine. Family members called. Friends texted. Phones went straight to voicemail. Social media remained inactive. Bank accounts showed no movement. The absence became total. And in the middle of that absence stood one person. Jerry Michael Osborne, Susan's husband. According to him, Susan had left on Memorial Day. He claimed she packed up, took Evan, and got into a vehicle with another man. The details changed each time he told the story. Sometimes it was a truck. Sometimes a silver SUV. Sometimes the man was a stranger. Sometimes he was Susan's brother. Nothing he said could be verified. Jerry did not report Susan or Evan missing. He did not contact her family. He did not ask law enforcement for help. Instead, he renovated the house. Floors were removed. Walls were repainted. Security cameras were taken down. Fires burned in the yard for days. When investigators finally returned with a warrant and forensic tools, the house no longer looked the way it had when Susan and Evan were last seen. But Luminol does not forget. This case is not about speculation. It is about documented timelines, forensic findings, and behavior that does not align with an innocent explanation. It is about how a missing persons case slowly revealed signs of violence, and how the absence of bodies can still leave behind a story written in traces. Tonight, we examine what happened before Susan and Evan disappeared, what investigators uncovered after, and why, years later, the case remains open. Because when evidence speaks, silence becomes suspicious. Before Susan Lynn Osborne and her son Evan vanished, their lives followed a pattern that was steady, predictable, and deeply rooted in responsibility. Susan Lynn Osborne was born on August 22, 1972. She grew up in what relatives described as a stable, working American household. She had two brothers, Brian and Jason, and a sister, Nancy. The family environment was not marked by chaos or instability. Her parents worked consistently and emphasized structure, routine, and emotional presence. Susan remained especially close to her mother, Linda, maintaining frequent contact well into adulthood. From a young age, Susan was described as independent and socially capable. She formed friendships easily and was often the one others relied on. That pattern continued throughout her life. Even during periods of stress, she tended to focus outward, prioritizing those around her rather than herself. Susan married in the early 2000s, but the relationship did not last. On June 25, 2002, she gave birth to her son, Evan. When the marriage ended, Susan chose not to return to Michigan, where much of her family lived. Instead, she made the decision to start over on her own in Alabama. According to those close to her, this was not an impulsive choice. It reflected her belief that stability was something she needed to build, not inherit. Later, Susan had a daughter, Anna Grace, with another partner. That relationship also ended, and what followed was a prolonged and emotionally exhausting custody battle. For several years, Susan fought through the legal system to remain a constant presence in her daughter's life. Friends and family later described this period as one of the most difficult chapters she ever faced. Despite setbacks, Susan remained focused, patient, and determined. Throughout all of this, Evan was at the center of her world. Evan was a quiet, thoughtful teenager. Teachers described him as intelligent, curious, and unusually mature for his age. He enjoyed science and chess and was known to approach tasks methodically. He was not reckless. He did not seek attention. He thrived on routine. Evan also had medical needs that required regular monitoring and prescribed medications. Susan was meticulous about his care. Appointments were scheduled in advance. Medications were tracked carefully. Missed checkups were not part of their lives. This detail would later become critical to understanding why investigators found it difficult to believe that Evan left voluntarily. Susan structured her life around her children. She worked when she could, managed the household independently, and maintained contact with family and friends. Those who knew her did not describe her as impulsive or secretive. She communicated openly. If plans changed, she explained why. If she needed time, she said so. Around 2009, Susan met a woman named Holly who moved in across the street. Both were single mothers, and the connection was immediate. Their friendship became daily and dependable. They talked often, supported one another, and shared the ordinary details of life. Over time, Holly became Susan's closest confidant. This friendship would later serve as one of the most important windows into Susan's state of mind before she disappeared. In 2013, Susan and Evan met Jerry Michael Osborne. The encounter appeared accidental. They were fishing near the water, something Susan and Evan enjoyed together. Jerry introduced himself casually and left. Days later, he appeared again. Conversations became regular. He showed interest in Evan's hobbies and spoke easily with him. Within months, the three were spending time together consistently. That fall, Susan and Evan moved into Jerry's home on Waterview Drive in Wetumpka. The location seemed ideal. The house sat on a private road surrounded by trees, with direct access to the Coosa River. It was quiet, isolated, and far from traffic or noise. Susan liked the sense of calm. Evan enjoyed being outdoors, helping around the property, and exploring nature. To outsiders, it appeared to be a positive transition. In January 2014, Susan and Jerry married. The ceremony was quiet and unannounced. There were no invitations, no guests. Even close friends and family learned about it only after the fact. When asked, Susan explained that they wanted something simple. At the time, no one interpreted this as a warning sign. For a period, life seemed stable. Susan focused on the household. Evan continued to do well in school. The family adopted 2 dogs, Sugar and Schnee. Weekends were spent fishing, cooking, and maintaining the property. From the outside, it looked like Susan had finally found peace after years of struggle. That appearance would not last. When Jerry Michael Osborne entered Susan Lynn Osborne's life, nothing about him immediately suggested danger. To those who met him briefly, he appeared reserved, polite, and largely unremarkable. It was only over time, and primarily behind closed doors, that his behavior began to change in ways that would later concern investigators and those closest to Susan. Jerry was a former United States Air Force airman. His military career ended early after disciplinary issues, and former colleagues later described him as hot-tempered, suspicious, and resistant to authority. After his discharge, Jerry worked as an emergency dispatcher connected to a military installation. The position gave him familiarity with crisis response systems and access to sensitive information, but it did not place him under constant supervision. When Susan met Jerry in 2013, the interaction seemed coincidental and harmless. They encountered one another while Susan and Evan were fishing, an activity they often enjoyed together. Jerry introduced himself briefly and left. Days later, he appeared again. Conversations followed. Jerry showed interest in Evan's hobbies, asked about school, and spoke to him in a way that felt engaging and attentive. Within months, the relationship progressed quickly. Susan and Evan moved into Jerry's home on Waterview Drive, a secluded property near the Coosa River. The isolation of the location initially appeared attractive. It offered privacy, quiet, and space. However, investigators would later note that the same features that made the house appealing also limited visibility, witnesses, and outside oversight. In January 2014, Susan and Jerry married. The wedding took place without guests, announcements, or prior notice. Family members and close friends learned about it only afterward. At the time, Susan explained that they wanted a simple, private ceremony. No immediate concerns were raised. Soon after the marriage, subtle changes began to appear. Jerry encouraged Susan to stop working, telling her that his income was sufficient and that she should focus on the household and children. At first, this was framed as support. Over time, it became expectation. Eventually, Susan became financially dependent on Jerry. Control extended beyond finances. Jerry began monitoring Susan's communication. He insisted on being present during phone calls. At times, he required her to use speakerphone when speaking to family or friends. Later, he checked her incoming and outgoing messages. Contact with her mother and siblings gradually diminished. Visits with Holly, once frequent, became rare. Susan's movements were also restricted. Jerry insisted on driving her to errands and appointments, often waiting nearby to bring her home immediately afterward. Unplanned outings were discouraged. The freedom Susan once exercised quietly disappeared. To outsiders, Jerry maintained a calm and cooperative demeanor. Neighbors described him as polite. In public settings, he showed no obvious signs of aggression. This contrast between public composure and private control is consistent with patterns investigators often see in cases involving coercive behavior. Inside the home, Jerry's conduct became increasingly unpredictable. He would leave for days without explanation, offering vague reasons related to work or personal matters. When Susan questioned these absences, his answers lacked detail and consistency. In one instance, Susan discovered through phone records that Jerry had been actively using his phone while claiming to be unreachable. There were calls to a taxi service and other contacts he could not explain. Shortly afterward, Jerry listed Susan's boat for sale without consulting her. The boat was a personal project, something she had restored herself and valued deeply. By the time Susan learned about the listing, it was already posted online. This action represented another shift. Decisions about Susan's property were now being made without her consent. In late 2016, Susan uncovered evidence that Jerry was seeing another woman. Messages showed that he had spent an evening with her, visiting a club and staying overnight at a hotel. Susan documented what she found and sent screenshots to Holly. This was one of the first times she explicitly shared her concerns with anyone. Then came another discovery. Susan found a profile linked to Jerry on a website associated with adult escort listings aimed at male clients. The profile included the photographs that obscured his face but clearly displayed distinctive tattoos. The phone number matched Jerry's. Although the account had been created years earlier, Susan realized the activity on the profile was recent. Conversations were ongoing during their marriage. This discovery marked a turning point. Susan moved into a separate bedroom and began speaking to Holly about leaving the marriage. She did not confront Jerry directly with the evidence. Instead, she asked indirect questions, testing his responses. Jerry denied everything. He dismissed the messages, denied contact with men, and deflected when pressed for details. For Susan, the issue was no longer infidelity alone. It was the realization that Jerry had been living a concealed life, one that required deception and secrecy. According to Holly, Susan expressed fear that knowing this information put her in a vulnerable position. In early 2017, Susan discussed plans to leave. Holly invited her to Florida, where she was preparing for her wedding. Susan was set to be the maid of honor. The conversations were frequent and detailed. Travel plans were discussed. Evan was expected to come along. Nothing in Susan's communication suggested she intended to disappear. By the spring of 2017, the marriage had reached a critical point. Susan had emotionally disengaged and was preparing to take action. Jerry, according to those close to Susan, appeared increasingly tense and agitated. What happened next would never be explained. In the final days of May 2017, nothing about Susan Lynn Osborne's behavior suggested she was preparing to disappear. Her communication remained consistent. Her plans were intact. Her responsibilities, especially those involving her children, were still being actively managed. On May 26th, Susan visited her daughter, Anna Grace, who was living with her father. That visit was routine. Later that same day, Susan spoke with her close friend Holly by phone. During the call, Susan mentioned that a letter had arrived at her home addressed to Holly's former address. She promised to forward it the following week. There was no urgency in her voice. No distress. No indication that anything was wrong. That same day, Evan stayed home from school, feeling unwell. This was not unusual. Susan monitored his health carefully and adjusted plans when necessary. According to those who knew her, Susan never minimized Evan's medical needs. On May 28th, Susan and Holly spoke again. The conversation was ordinary. They discussed Holly's upcoming wedding in Key West, travel logistics, and dress details. Susan was set to be the maid of honor. Evan was expected to accompany her on the trip. There was no tension, no sense of finality. The following day, Memorial Day, May 29th, they exchanged text messages. The tone remained casual. Everyday topics. No arguments. No coded language. No signs of fear. That evening, Holly sent another message. This time, there was no reply. At first, the silence did not immediately cause alarm. Susan occasionally became busy, and delays happened. But as the night passed and morning came without a response, concern began to grow. On May 30th, Holly tried calling Susan. There was no answer. She sent multiple messages throughout the day. None were delivered. Both Susan's and Evan's phones began going straight to voicemail. Other family members were also trying to reach Susan. The results were the same. No response. No activity. No explanation. That same day, Anna Grace and her paternal grandmother drove to the house on Waterview Drive. Evan had a medical appointment scheduled, and they intended to drop something off for him. When they arrived, Susan was not there. Instead, they were met by Jerry Osborne. According to their account, Jerry appeared agitated and visibly nervous. He was sweating heavily and refused to allow them inside the house. He claimed the home was a mess and insisted the visit be brief. When asked where Susan and Evan were, Jerry stated that Susan had left him, taken Evan, and gone off with another man. He did not offer specifics. When pressed for details, Jerry became irritated. He did not explain why Susan would leave without contacting her family or closest friend. He did not say where she was headed. He did not express concern about Evan's health or missed appointment. The visit ended abruptly, with Jerry closing the door. The next day, Evan did not attend his scheduled medical procedure. For those who knew Susan, this was the moment when the situation became unmistakably serious. Susan had never missed Evan's appointments. They required preparation and planning. Skipping one without notice was out of character and potentially dangerous. As the days passed, the silence continued. There was no activity on Susan's bank accounts. No credit card usage. No withdrawals. No travel records. Her passport remained unused. Evan's prescriptions were not refilled. No doctors were contacted. No pharmacies were visited. This was not the pattern of someone starting a new life. On May 30th and the days that followed, Jerry made no effort to report Susan or Evan missing. He did not contact law enforcement. He did not reach out to Susan's family. He did not ask Holly if she had heard from her. Instead, he maintained the story that Susan had left voluntarily. In later statements to police, Jerry claimed that on Memorial Day he and Susan had an argument. According to him, a man arrived outside the house. Susan packed up, took Evan, and left with him. Jerry described the man differently each time. In one account, he was tall with dark hair and a beard. In another, he wore sunglasses. At times, Jerry claimed he did not know who the man was. In other versions, he suggested it might have been Susan's brother. The vehicle also changed. Sometimes it was a truck. Sometimes a silver Nissan SUV. None of these details could be corroborated. By the end of June, Susan's mother mailed a letter to her daughter. It was eventually returned as undeliverable. On July 28, 2017, nearly 2 months after the last confirmed contact, Susan Lynn Osborne and her son Evan were officially reported missing. By then, whatever had happened inside the house on Waterview Drive was already weeks in the past, and the silence had become permanent. When Susan Lynn Osborne and her son Evan were officially reported missing on July 28, 2017, the Elmore County Sheriff's Office initiated a standard missing persons investigation. What investigators encountered almost immediately, however, suggested this case would not remain routine. Officers were dispatched to the house on Waterview Drive to conduct a welfare check and gather preliminary information. They were met by Jerry Osborne. From the outset, his demeanor stood out. He appeared unprepared for the visit and asked officers to keep it brief, stating that he was in the middle of cleaning the house. When asked about Susan and Evan, Jerry repeated the account he had already shared with family members. He claimed that on Memorial Day, May 29th, he and Susan had an argument. According to him, Susan packed her belongings, took Evan, and left with another man who arrived outside the home. Jerry stated that he had not seen or heard from them since. Investigators noted inconsistencies almost immediately. Jerry's description of the man and the vehicle changed between statements. In one version, the man was unknown. In another, Jerry suggested it might have been Susan's brother. The vehicle alternated between a truck and a silver Nissan SUV. None of these details could be verified through surveillance footage, witness accounts, or travel records. Law enforcement began examining digital evidence. From May 30th onward, there was no activity associated with Susan or Evan. No phone usage. No bank transactions. No credit card charge. No social media engagement. Their passports had not been used, and there were no flight or hotel records under either name. Even more concerning, Evan's prescriptions had not been refilled, and no medical providers had been contacted. Investigators recognized this as a critical point. Evan's health needs required ongoing care. The absence of medical follow-up strongly suggested he had not left voluntarily. A walkthrough of the house revealed another anomaly. None of Susan's or Evan's personal belongings were present. Clothing, documents, and everyday items were gone, as though they had never lived there. While this might appear consistent with Jerry's claim that Susan left, investigators found the totality of the absence unusual. There were no signs of hurried packing. No discarded items. No trace of an exit. As the investigation progressed, officers returned to the property with a search warrant. By then, the house had undergone significant changes. Hardwood floors had been removed and replaced with carpet. Walls had been repainted. Several rooms appeared recently renovated. Jerry claimed the changes were part of routine home improvement. He also stated that Susan had written offensive messages on the walls before leaving, forcing him to repaint. Investigators found no evidence to support this claim. No paint residue. No spray cans. No markings beneath the new layers. Neighbors provided additional information. Several residents reported hearing loud noises during the night of May 29th into the early hours of May 30th. Some described the sounds as consistent with gunshots. Others recalled seeing large fires burning in Jerry's yard over the following days. The fires were described as unusually intense, producing thick smoke and lasting for extended periods. One neighbor reported feeling heat from their own property. Investigators also learned that Jerry's father had been seen assisting with the fires. Another detail raised concern. The family's two dogs, Sugar and Sheen, went missing shortly after Susan and Evan disappeared. On June 12th, Jerry turned both animals in at a local shelter, claiming they were strays. Shelter staff later reported that Jerry mistakenly listed one of the dogs under the name Susan on the intake paperwork, an error they found unsettling. Security footage that might have clarified events was unavailable. Jerry had removed the home's original security camera system and replaced it with a new one. The original hardware and data had been erased. He claimed the system needed upgrading, though investigators confirmed it had been functional. The most significant development came with forensic testing. Investigators applied luminol throughout the house. Under forensic light, approximately 20 separate areas reacted, indicating the presence of biological material. Samples were collected from the kitchen, bathroom, and laundry room. DNA analysis later confirmed that the material matched Susan Lynn Osborne and her son Evan. This finding directly contradicted Jerry's account that Susan and Evan left the house unharmed. Search dogs were brought to the property. They alerted strongly near a utility shed at the far end of the yard. Despite a thorough inspection and dismantling of the structure, no remains were found. Searches expanded to the surrounding woods and the Coosa River using drones, volunteers, and dive teams. Nothing was recovered. By this point, the case had shifted from a missing persons investigation to a suspected criminal matter. Yet without bodies or direct evidence identifying a cause of death, prosecutors faced a legal barrier. The House had spoken, but it had not spoken loudly enough to secure an arrest. Despite the mounting concerns and forensic findings, the investigation into the disappearance of Susan Lynn Osborne and her son Evan reached a legal standstill. From a prosecutorial standpoint, the case faced a critical limitation. There were no bodies, no confirmed cause of death, no eyewitnesses. While the DNA evidence established that both Susan and Evan had been injured inside the home on Waterview Drive, it could not determine when, how, or under what circumstances those injuries occurred. Without that clarity, criminal charges could not be sustained in court. Jerry Osborne, through legal counsel, declined to provide further statements. He invoked his right to remain silent and ceased all communication with investigators and Susan's family. Law enforcement documented every inconsistency in his prior accounts, but inconsistencies alone were not sufficient for arrest. 37 days after Susan and Evan were last seen, Jerry filed for divorce. In the filing, he stated that Susan had left the marriage and the home. Because Susan was not present to contest the claim, the divorce was granted without objection. Shortly afterward, Jerry began selling personal property and eventually sold the house on Waterview Drive, despite it being the focal point of an active investigation. He later relocated to Prattville, Alabama, approximately 30 minutes from Wetumpka, and entered a new relationship. Publicly, he maintained a low profile, avoided media attention, and continued to refuse interviews. For Susan's family and the local community, the absence of resolution has been devastating. Each year on May 29th, a memorial vigil is held in Wetumpka. Candles are placed along the river near the area where Susan and Evan lived. Friends, relatives, and neighbors gather not only to remember them but to remind authorities that the case remains open. Within the community, few believe Susan and Evan left voluntarily. The evidence suggests a sudden, violent interruption of their lives. Yet until new information emerges, the truth remains legally unreachable. The case of Susan Lynn Osborne and Evan remains open and unanswered. The disappearance of Susan Lynn Osborne and her 14-year-old son Evan did not end with answers. It ended with silence, uncertainty, and a legal void that continues to haunt those who knew them. From the outside, the case appears straightforward. A mother and her child vanished without warning. Their digital lives stopped completely. Their routines were interrupted midstream. Medical care ceased. Financial activity ended. There was no trail to follow, no indication of a planned departure, and no credible explanation for such an abrupt disappearance. Inside the house on Waterview Drive, investigators found what silence could not erase. Luminol revealed biological traces belonging to Susan and Evan in multiple areas of the home. DNA confirmed their presence in places where violence may have occurred. Renovations appeared rushed and poorly explained. Security footage that could have clarified events was removed and destroyed. Fires burned for days in the yard. Personal belongings vanished. The family dogs were surrendered as strays. Each detail alone raised questions. Together, they formed a pattern. Yet the law does not operate on patterns alone. Without recovered remains, without a confirmed cause of death, and without direct eyewitness testimony, prosecutors were unable to move forward. The case stalled not because investigators lacked concern or effort, but because the legal threshold for criminal charges could not be met. This is the harsh reality of many missing persons cases. Evidence can strongly suggest harm without proving it beyond reasonable doubt. Suspicion can exist without becoming indictment. And time, instead of clarifying the truth, can bury it deeper. Jerry Osborne has never been charged. He has never publicly explained the inconsistencies in his accounts. He has exercised his legal right to remain silent. Under the law, that silence cannot be used as proof of guilt. For Susan's family, for Evan's loved ones, and for the Wetumpka community, that reality offers no comfort. Every year, the memorial vigil returns to the river near their home. Candles float on the water. Names are spoken. The absence is acknowledged. These gatherings are not just acts of remembrance. They are statements, a reminder that this case is not forgotten, that two lives did not simply fade away. Susan was a devoted mother who spent years fighting to protect her children. Evan was a thoughtful teenager with plans, responsibilities, and a future still forming. Nothing in their lives suggested they would choose to vanish together without explanation. The case remains open, and with it remains a quiet hope that someone will speak, that evidence overlooked will surface, that time will reveal what fear or control once concealed. Until then, Susan and Evan remain missing, not just from a house on Waterview Drive, but from a system still searching for the truth. Their story is unfinished.